Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Andy Sue. I'm a 3L at UCLA Law and I am co-president of the UCLA Law ACS chapter. Today I'm honored to introduce Professor Sharmila Murthy and Washington State Attorney General Bob Ferguson. Sharmila Murthy is an associate professor and director of faculty scholarship and research at Suffolk University Law School. She teaches and writes on issues of property law, environmental law, international environmental law, poverty law, and human rights. Professor Murthy has won multiple teaching awards, and she's widely recognized for her scholarship on access to clean drinking water and sanitation, and on state and local action on global climate change. She's the faculty advisor for Suffolk Law ACS chapter. Next, it is my honor to introduce Washington State Attorney General Bob Ferguson. I had the pleasure of meeting Attorney General Ferguson after his speech at the 2019 ACS National Convention. Throughout the Trump administration, Attorney General Bob Ferguson was on the front lines of legal challenges against the administration, including successfully blocking the first Muslim travel ban. Last summer, while interning at the California Attorney General Environment Section, I had the privilege to work with Washington State Attorney General's office on challenging the federal government's rollback of Clean Water Act rules. One of the reasons I was especially interested to work on these cases was I had just written a legal comment on including climate change in the Clean Water Act 401 process. It was largely and partly inspired by Washington State's Attorney General's office and their work on clean water. Along with federal litigation, Attorney General Ferguson has been dedicated to environmental justice issues. He created the Wing Luke Civil Rights Division dedicated to protecting the civil rights of Washingtonians. He has filed multiple legal actions against the U.S. Department of Energy to protect hundreds of Hanford nuclear reservation workers at risk of exposure to harmful toxic waste. Both lawsuits led to successful outcomes. He has also created the Council for Environmental Protection within the Washington State Attorney General's office. Please join me in welcoming Professor Sharmila Murthy and Washington State Attorney General Bob Ferguson.
Thank you so much, Andy, for that kind introduction. And it's really my honor and pleasure to have the chance to speak with Attorney General Ferguson and to really learn a little bit about the incredible leadership that his office has played in the United States. So Attorney General Ferguson, I know that over the last 4 years in particular, the role of attorney generals in the United States became incredibly crucial. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about some of the federal litigation that your office brought, in particular, that was challenging some of the rules, executive orders, regulations, proposals that were brought under President Trump.
Sure, and thanks, Professor. It's great to see you, and thanks, Andy, for that introduction as well. And thanks to everybody who's joined in. I always enjoy speaking about my job, but especially with students and especially with people who are interested in our Constitution. I spend a lot of my time thinking about the Constitution with my team, as you might imagine. I've got thoughts on the subject, and just I'm really, it always gives me hope for the future that we have folks who care about the Constitution and the rule of law in our future as a country. So yeah, when it comes to the last 4 years, my office has been pretty active with litigation at the federal level. We ended up filing nearly 100 lawsuits against the Trump administration. That's a lot of litigation, and people have strong views about that. A lot of people in my state think it's great. A lot of people in my state think it's the worst thing I could possibly do. And so people have strong views about it because we're challenging an administration. From my perspective, a key part of it is choosing good cases. We have a process for doing that. And I think our win-loss record demonstrates that. I think we end up with 42 decisions so far from those cases. We've won 41 of those, or 40 of those. I think it's 40 and 2. So I think it's an indication we're bringing good cases against the administration. But I recognize these are kind of high profile and controversial. So all those cases would be cases I get personally involved in, Professor. I decide whether we're going to file a case or not. That's not delegated to my very capable team. Those are decisions I need to make because they're so consequential. The other thing I just will add is that obviously there's a group of states who often work together on these cases. It's not just one state. But just as one more point to make is often when there is a multi-state lawsuit, typically one state is chosen to lead the lawsuit. And that one state does 98% of the work. You choose your cliche. You can't have too many chefs in the kitchen. You get the idea. And so we led, we led about, I think, 36 of those cases. So that's a lot. So Washington, California, New York, those were often the three states you would see leading these different lawsuits against the administration. So we weren't simply filing them, we were very active in the drafting the complaints, doing the discovery, taking the depositions, doing the oral argument. So it was a busy time for office.
Wow, wonderful. And I should say that we know that we have a lot of people watching this discussion, and I want to invite folks to, if they'd like to ask questions as they arise, because we'll be able to integrate them into my Q&A with Attorney General Ferguson. And in addition, you can feel free to do that through the app as well, and then they're going to get transcribed over to Zoom for me. But in terms of the arc of our conversation today, we're going to delve into a little bit more detail about some of the substantive work, the cases that Attorney General Ferguson has brought. And then we're going to end with talking a little bit about his own career path to being the Attorney General. So, and if there are other topics that are of interest to you that you'd like to know about that his office has worked on, please feel free to put that in the Q&A. So let's maybe talk about one of the first cases that you brought that was incredibly high profile, that resulted in a win. It was the travel ban, one of the first travel bans, the Muslim ban, as it was described as. And I understand that Washington actually was really using quite a novel strategy, because not even just bringing it on behalf of individuals, but really thinking about the harms to the state, bringing companies on board. And I'm wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about the initial decision to bring on the case, as well as that legal strategy.
Sure. Yeah. The first, as you all know, I think there were multiple travel bans in the end. They got more narrow as they went forward. But this was the original travel ban, which Donald Trump signed within a couple weeks of taking office. And so he signed it on, I think, a Friday afternoon, as I recall. And so my team, we've been thinking about challenging a travel ban. That'd been the news that you might have a travel ban. So we were giving some thought to how we might challenge one. So when it came out, the team worked all that weekend. We were in the office working that weekend, and we filed our complaint that Monday. So just within a few days. And then later on that week, we were before a judge seeking injunction to stop it, and we were successful. You know, there's a lot about the travel ban. So it was the first case against the administration. We were the first state to do it. It's worth remembering, you know, when the travel ban was signed, it was actually popular around the country. You know, polls showed a lot of support for it. There was a lot of opposition, but there was a lot of support. But legal experts, if you turned on CNN, legal experts said a legal challenge will never work. You know, AGs can't bring these lawsuits. The president has a lot of authority. We felt differently, and I'm glad that we went forward and prevailed on it. I guess what I would say is that in terms of the legal strategy, I guess one thing I'd emphasize for all of you is that, you know, I often say this to my team, is that a legal case, yes, you're citing cases, of course, right? You're talking about the Constitution, of course. You're building your facts. But really, at the end of the day, when you are writing that brief, when you're giving your oral argument, when you're communicating to the public, as I do, about a case, you're telling a story. People are storytellers. They relate to stories. They orient around stories. That's just how we're wired as human beings. And take my word for it, a federal judge is no different than your kid or your grandparent or anybody else. We're wired for stories. And so to your question, Professor, yes, part of our strategy was we're not just telling one story, we're telling a lot of stories. What are the impacts of this travel ban on everybody in our state? So it included things like students who were traveling abroad, who had green cards, perfectly legal residents of our state, who could not come back to Washington state because of the travel ban. They were not allowed to return back to their home. We also told the story of companies, large and small, whose hiring practices were impacted by the travel ban, right? So we had big companies who signed briefs in support saying, hey, this is going to impact us, how it impacted our economy, how it impacted our universities, students who've been accepted to the University of Washington and other universities who could not come to our universities because of the travel ban. So we tried to weave all this together in sort of one compelling narrative. The other thing I'll add is that, you know, sort of one of the things that the administration was saying was the travel ban was necessary to protect the United States, right? It was like a national defense type of thing, a security thing. Well, we decided to take that head on. So we had a declaration from a large number of national security experts, which included, by the way, cabinet members from President George W. Bush, right? These were Democrats and Republicans, very high profile, who signed declarations saying, not only will the travel ban not be good for public safety, it won't make us safer, it'll make us less safe, was their argument. And so it's one thing to think about when you're doing a brief is you got to anticipate what the other side's going to say and rebut that, tell your own story on that, but also enlarge that story, bring as many voices as you can into those cases, because I think it helps us, and I think it certainly helped us in that case when we eventually prevailed.
Great. And what about more recently? The U.S. Postal Service has, what we often just took for granted, that man was delivering our letters, all of a sudden became a very contentious topic and the subject of one of your more recent legal challenges. I'm wondering if you could maybe provide some context for why you were suing over the U.S. Postal Service and maybe how that played out.
Yeah, in some respects, so the first travel ban case and then the Postal Service case are almost sort of the bookends of the 100 or so lawsuits we filed. So the Postal Service case, I mean, you were all reading newspapers at the time, of course, where the head of the Postal Service was really rolling back and making dramatic service changes to how the post office delivered the mail. And whether coincidentally or not, it happened to be right around the election. And so there are states like Washington, as an example. We are an all vote by mail state. There is no place to go to vote in person. You vote by mail. That is how you vote. Oregon, our neighbor to the south, it's the same way. In fact, in Oregon, your ballot must be received on election day. If it arrives the day after election day, it does not count. Some states are organized that way. Some states are both vote in the polls or vote by mail. The bottom line, though, is that slowing down of delivery service, which was in the news, was well documented, can have a dramatic impact on people's right to vote for who's going to be their president. And so in Washington, because we're an all vote by mail state, we became interested in this and thought about filing a lawsuit. We actually ended up leading a lawsuit of 14 states, which included key swing states like Wisconsin, Michigan, Nevada. Those AGs joined us in our lawsuit that we filed here in Washington state. And so, it's interesting that a lot of these cases are on huge issues that are very consequential. A Muslim travel ban, whether people can travel to our country or not, or people from our state can come back to our state, or the Postal Service, right? Again, we're trying to tell a story there. So the story was partly about the election, but also we had declarations from veterans who could not get their medications in a timely way because of the slowdown of the mail and how that impacted their health. We had declarations from seniors telling a similar story. We had declarations from small businesses saying, hey, in order for me to survive as a business, I need products to arrive on time or get out on time, or I'm not going to make it. So again, telling multiple stories, not just about the election, as important as that was, but enlarging that story, I think made a difference as well. And then also, I think one thing to keep in mind is that, for those of you who are in law school or think about going to law school is, I found when I was in law school, classes like civil procedure, oh my God, I thought, how is this ever going to be relevant to my life as a lawyer? Civil procedure, it just seems so arcane in these rules, and what does it matter? I mean, I'm just telling you, my whole life is civil procedure right now. And those rules are, we talk about them all the time, and they matter a great deal. And seemingly obscure federal laws like the Administrative Procedure Act that does little more than just ensure the federal government follows certain basic procedures before enacting policies that can have an impact on the people to make sure that they're following that. We often win these cases, Professor, because the administration refused to follow these sort of basic requirements put in place in federal law to ensure that the people have access to decision-making, there's transparency around decision-making, that they can weigh in public comments. And the administration, for whatever reason, from that first case to the last one, routinely failed to follow those basic procedures. And that was a key reason we were able to win so many of those cases, including that case. So we won that case, we got an injunction, and importantly, the judge required many things, changes in those, rolling back those service changes, but it included even requiring the Postal Service to go through every single post office in Wisconsin, for example, and those other states to clear out any ballots that were lying around. I talked to the Wisconsin AG afterwards. Wisconsin was decided by 20,000 votes. She really believes that lawsuit literally made a difference in the outcome of that election because of how many ballots were just hanging around post offices that had to be gone through and picked up and delivered on time.
Great. And we just got a question in that I think is incredibly timely because we are talking about these very hot button issues. And so here's the question. I wonder whether you have any reflections on the trend of the increased challenges to federal policies by coalitions of states. Is the trend of states challenging federal policymaking a positive development, or will it come back to bite the Biden administration, especially given the current composition of the federal judiciary? And do you really think that in many ways, do you really see your role changing now that there has been a change in the administration? Was, the last handful of years, all of these federal challenges really a response to what was perceived as the questioner puts it, a uniquely dangerous administration, or something different?
Yeah, those questions, thanks for those questions. And there's a lot of questions kind of in there to unpack. So first, I think just to give a little step back, prior to Barack Obama being president, you'd occasionally see an attorney general file a lawsuit against the administration, but there was not some concerted effort by AGs of either party to file a whole bunch of lawsuits against administration. Okay, they were kind of one-offs. When Barack Obama was president, especially in his second term, Republican AGs filed dozens and dozens and dozens of lawsuits against the administration. That included Obamacare, famously, right? A case they lost at the Supreme Court in a 5-4 decision. So when Democratic AGs were doing it, it was sort of following after that experience that Republican AGs had done against the Obama administration. And it's continuing now with the Biden administration. If I just read an article today about there's already been a half dozen lawsuits filed by Republican AGs against the Biden administration. So that background, whether it's a good thing or not, I guess what I would say is, I guess maybe two thoughts. One is, well, it's a good question. I guess I don't sort of think about whether it's a good thing or not. My job as an attorney general, my job is to do what I think is right for the people of my state. Full stop, right? That's my analysis. And so I understand that there are larger consequences going on to some of my decisions. But as the attorney general, my job description, my mission, my reason for being is to be an advocate for the people of my state. That's my client, right? And so as any lawyer knows, you need to be an advocate for your client and do that as vigorously as you possibly can. So while I appreciate the question, I don't think about it in that way. I do know, I feel very confident that what I did was the right thing for the people of my state. For the dreamers of my state who could have been deported had we not filed a lawsuit and been successful at the Supreme Court that allows them to stay here in this country as dreamers, right? That mattered a hell of a lot to those thousands of dreamers in my state and across the country. What I would say is that there's a guy named Charles Crottheimer. He's passed away, but a conservative columnist. And he actually wrote a whole column about this subject, if you're interested in it. He wrote it maybe 2 or 3 years ago before he passed away. And it's actually fascinating. What he wrote was he addressed this very question. And he's a conservative, by the way, and he's talking about these Democratic AGs doing all this. And what his analysis was, which I think is fair, is he said, look, ideally in our constitutional framework, the check on the executive branch would be Congress. That's how we're set up. Congress should be the check on the administration. He said Congress has utterly failed in that role, was his perspective, okay? But the executive needs a check. Whether you agree with the executive or don't, the system requires checks and balances. And he said in our constitutional system, one of the beauties of it is if there's a void, if someone's not filling a role, somebody else will fill it. And he said that's what Democratic AGs were doing. So his point was, you may hate what they're doing, you may love what they're doing, but they're filling an important role because Congress has abdicated that check on the executive branch. I think he raises some important points. Do I think of it quite that way? No, I'm sort of too busy working on our cases and deciding what's a good case and what's a bad case and going forward on the good ones. But I think he raises a good point. I think it's healthy for our democracy. I think it's healthy for our Constitution if administrations do have a check. And let's be honest, a case, I'm only gonna be successful if I've got a good case. If I've got a bad case, a federal judge is gonna kick it out. So it's a waste of my time and my team's time to file bad cases. We're only gonna file good cases. And the fact that we won virtually every case we filed, I think suggests it was a good thing we did it because it prevented the administration from taking illegal and unconstitutional actions.
Great. So it's great. We're getting a handful of questions coming in, and there's one that seems to be a nice segue, what you just talked about, which is, does the fact that Washington State sits in the Ninth Circuit, does that at all influence your decisions to take cases, or perhaps allow you to have played a role that perhaps a state in a different circuit might not have played?
That's possible. I guess what I'd say is, I don't want to speak for my colleagues, although my colleagues and I obviously chat about sort of the tactics around a lawsuit, right? Once we decide we're going to file, hey, who's going to join it and what are the claims going to be? And obviously as a team, we discuss that. I guess what I would say is, first of all, the Ninth Circuit is not nearly as liberal as its reputation might suggest. As you know, Donald Trump and his appointments has changed that court significantly. So just as a starting point, number one, it is not the Ninth Circuit that you may have thought of 20 years ago. It's changed dramatically and is far more towards the middle than it used to be even 10 years ago. So that's number one. Number two, when you file a case in the district court, gets up to the Court of Appeals, of course, you get a 3-judge panel. That's a lottery of the many judges in the Ninth Circuit. So it was not unusual for us to get a 3-judge panel where you had 2 appointees who were appointed by Republican presidents, for example. And that's, of course, in circuits all across the country. What I would say is that we routinely won cases in which the majority of a panel or the trial court judge was a Republican appointee. In fact, one of our cases that we had just in the last year, we had a panel, I think we're in the DC court, if I recall correctly, Professor, it wasn't Ninth Circuit, but the 3-judge panel were all Trump appointees, all 3. And we won that case 3-0. So what I would say is we're obviously aware where we're filing a case. We pay attention to which judges are selected, and we obviously do our research on those judges. But for me, it doesn't change my calculation of whether I file a case or not. If it's a good case, we're going to file it. If it's not, we're not. Once in a while, there's a case like the case for Dreamers where we were co-leading that case with New York, for example. So there did have to be a decision on it. We're going to file it here in Washington or in New York. For a variety of reasons, we chose to file it in New York. One of my attorneys flew to New York for the oral argument. But otherwise, it's mainly driven by which state's the lead state. As I mentioned before, Washington, California, New York. And that's partly because of the AGs maybe had the most interest, but also had the resources and the expertise in our offices, frankly, to bring those cases.
Okay, great. Let me take a pause from the questions from the audience and actually come back to a topic that's near and dear to my heart, which is environmental law. And I know that your office has actually been quite active in terms of trying to address the rollback of a lot of environmental protections, whether it was relating to the Clean Power Plan or the Clean Water Act or NEPA, and I'm wondering if you could just maybe talk a little bit about your office's role in those very highly technical issues, but that are actually very important from a health and environmental safety standpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess I've got a few thoughts to get that part of the conversation going. So, I live in Washington State. I'm a 4th-generation Washingtonian. So in my state, the environment is part of who we are as a people. It's pretty central to us. It's important to me as an individual with my kids and the outdoors and all that it involves and the future of our planet and for my kids and later grandkids someday. So a couple of things. One is, when I became Attorney General, Professor, we're a large law office, I should mention. We have more than 600 attorneys, 600 professional staff, 13 offices around the state. We're the largest law firm in the state, one of the larger AG offices in the entire country. So we're a big, big operation. But we did not have in Washington State a team, a single lawyer in the office who was dedicated to bring affirmative cases, environmental cases on behalf of the people. So we represented the State Department of Ecology as they do their regulatory work. But in terms of cases being brought, litigating cases on behalf of the people, our environment didn't exist, didn't have it. So I've changed that. I've created a team now, a division that does that work. So number one, I just encourage folks to think about as you go forward in your careers and do great things, think about wherever you're at, think about what resources you have, right? But also think about, well, what do we not have? Where are our gaps? What can we do? I mean, just part of my job is to kind of think creatively about our office, the work we're doing, but also importantly, the work we're not doing. And why aren't we doing that work? And if we're not doing it, find a way to make it happen. So now, because we created that, we were then in a position to, this was pre-Trump, we weren't planning on some Trump administration, we were in a position to do that environmental work that Andy talked about. So of the Trump litigation, of the 100 or so cases we filed, half of those cases, believe it or not, were related to the environment. I mean, it's incredible, kind of staggering to think about, but this is not a political statement, it's just a fact that the last administration really was systematic in trying to roll back environmental regulations and protections put in place by presidents of both parties. I mean, that's just a fact, which required a lot of litigation. California was very active in this area. We worked a lot with California, but we had the resources to be of assistance on that. I guess what I would also say is that in doing that work, we bring a lot of cases just here in Washington State, obviously. So we've sued companies like Monsanto for the PCBs that have inundated our waterways, our streams, our rivers because of their conduct. And we recently settled that case for about $100 million. That's money that goes back to our state to help repair our environment, which we think is a good thing. So I guess what I would say is that it's been a big focus for me to put a team in place that can bring these cases. They're critically important. Many of those cases obviously connect to climate and the future of our planet. And I think states can and should have an increasing role in this area. Not that many state AGs actually have a team like we have in Washington State or in California that have the expertise. That's a very specialized area of the law, as you all know, that have the expertise to bring these kinds of cases in our states or even at the national level as well. So that is something I hope to see more AGs take on because we frankly need more voices in that area.
Great. And maybe a follow-up question. So President Biden has made environmental justice a strong priority in his administration, but this is actually something that you've also made a priority in your office. And I'm wondering if you could say a few words about that in particular.
Yeah, in fact, as we speak, we're actually having a symposium taking a break from right now here with Gonzaga Law School. Gonzaga, by the way, the home of the future national NC2A basketball men's champions, by the way, in case you don't have them on your bracket. But Gonzaga Law School's in Spokane, Washington. And you may know them from their basketball team, but they also have a law school there. And so my office is co-hosting with Gonzaga Law School a symposium on environmental justice. It's the first time we've done it. It's a 2-day symposium. Tribal leaders, organizations are on the front ends of these impacts and the inequities around environmental policies that harm certain communities much more than others. Look, my neighborhood where I grew up is not suffering from environmental degradation in the neighborhood I grew up in. That is very different than many other places across our state here in Washington State. And that, of course, is true across our country as well. And so frankly, Professor, I mean, this is an area, in fact, I'm hiring an attorney, specifically an environmental justice attorney, to do this work specifically, right? Who's focused on that mission for our office. Because I think there's been an increased focus on these issues. You mentioned President Biden, but the way I look at it is you can have all the laws you want on the books, right? But speaking as a lawyer, right, that those laws are only effective if you have someone enforcing those laws. And not just someone, but someone who knows what the heck they're doing, someone who's good at it, someone's got the training, someone's got the resources, someone who can hire the experts that cost millions of dollars to bring these complex cases against huge corporations that, trust me, have a lot of resources to defend themselves. And so I think that is something that you're going to see more of. Certainly in my office, that's become an increased focus for my office, and something I'm glad to see as a movement. I'm glad to see the president speaking out about that as well.
Yeah, great. And you mentioned tribes. And one of the things that really interested me when I was doing a little bit of research on Washington State is the consultation policy that you now have with tribes, that in particular says that your office will ensure that Indigenous groups, tribes have free, prior, and informed consent, which was striking to me as someone who has studied international law and knows that that's even a phrase that mirrors the work of mirrors language in the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples internationally. And I just thought that was really quite remarkable. I'm wondering if you could say a few words about what led to that policy and how it's being implemented.
Sure. So in terms of what led to it, maybe I'll address that first and then speak to it a bit more. So in Washington State, we have 29 federally recognized tribes in Washington State. Tribes, as you might imagine, just have huge impacts on our state, on our economy, on our way of life. Who we are as Washingtonians, honestly, derives so much from tribes and tribal members, to put it very mildly. And so part of it, where it came out of, Professor, was there's a tribal leader here in Washington State. She's actually a national leader now. Fawn Sharp is her name. And she has, you mentioned this language mirrors international language, right? Well, that's by design, because Fawn Sharp has really been interested in this concept of free, prior, and informed consent. And one thing just to emphasize for the students here is that, in fact, I just was talking to my son, Jack, and my daughter, Katie. They just turned 13. They have a Washington history class that they have, and they're on a chapter of tribes and treaties in Washington State. And one thing I was emphasizing with them is tribes are sovereign nations, right? They're sovereign governments. I mean, that is something that I want to be very clear about, right? And so what Fawn Sharp has pushed, and other tribal leaders, is, hey, wait a second. We tribes are sovereign nations. The state of Washington, in this case, should treat us as such. We're not just some community here, right? We're a sovereign nation. If you're going to take some action that directly impacts us as a nation, maybe you should talk to us about that first. Maybe we should have a consultation about that, right? Maybe you need our consent before you do that, depending on the circumstances. So it seemed to me that made a lot of sense. And so, frankly, there's a lot of conversations with Fawn and other tribal leaders. It was educating myself on these issues, thanks to Fawn and other tribal leaders, and then adopting that policy for the AG's office. So what that means, I'm going to oversimplify it a little bit, but if we as a state are taking an action that directly impacts my office, it's going to directly impact a tribe, depending on what it is, we provide a notice to them or consult with them about it. So for example, it's already proven dividends. For example, we do work where we draft the language for initiatives, the ballot title that goes on the ballot that you see. So someone drafts initiative, we do the 30 or so words that go in the ballot title. my team saw after we adopted this policy that one of these initiative proposals embedded in there was a policy that had a dramatic impact for tribal schools. And so we had a requirement to notify tribes about that. Well, they appreciated hearing about that, right? And my team would not have done that. They wouldn't have been thinking about it unless we had an internal policy as an office that if we see that type of thing, to provide that notice to those tribes. So I think we're now in our second year of this policy. It's working well. We want to get it codified in state law. And frankly, it's my hope that state governments and other AGs adopt this as well. It seems like the fair thing to do. It seems like the right thing to do. One can decrease conflicts with tribes that are unnecessary as a result of that. And so it's one that we're in the early stages, but have had really good success so far.
Great, great. So let me return actually to looking at the queue, because we've got a few questions, and several of them are of the sort of same flavor, which is how much do you coordinate with other state AGs outside of the public eye? And what do you think is really going to be on your agenda now that you've got a change in the presidential administration? Maybe that matters, maybe that doesn't matter, but really, how do you see that coordination or the role that Washington's playing perhaps changing?
So, so in terms of communicating with AGs first, and I'll start talking about kind of the things that might be on the horizon. So just remind me of that, Professor, if I forget. But in terms of AGs, we talk a lot. I guess I'd start with that. Yesterday, there was I can't tell you what the case was, but there was something I read that another state AG had done. That was a different approach than what we did in Washington. So I just picked up the phone, called that AG up, and talked to him about it. Hey, how'd you do that? What made you think about that? How involved were you in that? What did your team think about that? Is your state statute different than mine? And I've gone back to my team to say, hey, this other state seemed to do well by this. How come we didn't do it that way, right? So first I'd start by saying it's not unusual that I just pick up the phone and call an AG if I've got something to talk about, and frankly, vice versa. Definitely with, during the Trump years, there were regular communications amongst Democratic AGs because there was so much litigation going on. And so what I would say is, for example, the Democratic AGs, for example, we have a weekly phone call. That's just a weekly call. That's a standing call. But of course, we have calls all the time just to one another, as you might imagine. Our teams talk all the time. It's also not just Democrat to Democratic AG, right? Candidly, the Attorney General I may be closest to in this country happens to be a Republican, who I've just known for a long time. And so I was just calling him the other day. He's going through a tough time right now. I'll spare you who it is, but politics is a challenging time right now, I think, in the Republican Party. And so I just called that AG up to say, hey, I'm thinking about you and hang in there, kind of thing. And so I often, and kind of a segue to the next question was kind of what's next, is I actually found myself, I'm a Democrat, a bit more aligned with some Republican AGs on what is a big issue, which is the opioids epidemic that we have in this country. You may have read about litigation that AGs have brought against Purdue Pharmaceutical, for example, and the Sackler family, which owns Purdue Pharmaceutical, and other entities as well. In Washington, I've been very, very involved in this area. We've filed a lot of litigation. And candidly, there's a couple AGs who are Republican, so I feel more closely aligned on how best to litigate those cases, and whether to settle and what's a proper settlement, or whether to litigate. So these things are not, I want to be clear, the Trump stuff obviously tend to be more partisan in the sense that Republican AGs weren't suing the Trump administration, but that's unusual. For the most part, from the AG world, these issues aren't partisan. Consumer protection, right? The opioids epidemic, these are not partisan issues. And so what I would say in looking ahead, for example, we have a trial this fall against 3 Fortune 15 corporations. These are huge, huge corporations. We have a trial right here, and I'm dialing in from the basement of my house in North Seattle. So just a few miles from here is a courthouse in downtown Seattle. That's where the lawsuit starts. I think that case is going to trial. That'll be a national news story. This lawsuit is, borderline existential for those corporations. The damages we'd be seeking are in the billions, not the millions, but the billions. So as you can imagine, it's a huge investment of resources for my team to take on 3 Fortune 15 corporations in a courthouse in downtown Seattle. So that's just one example, but we feel the harm they did by acting illegally and putting profits ahead of people is wrong. And the harm that's been done to my state and to every state for everyone who's on this call is profound. And so that's a big case that's coming up and that we're very focused on.
Great, thank you. Someone asked a question about cannabis and whether or not, the exact question is, do you anticipate a conflict between the state AGs and the Biden administration regarding cannabis law? And will there be a, quote, Garland versus Reich case?
Yeah, it's so just by way of background, I bet the person who asked the question knows this, but Washington was one of the first 2 states to legalize marijuana. It was Washington and Colorado. It was the same year I got elected Attorney General. That was 2012, the voters voted and I got elected. So I came into office January 2013 with a brand new law legalizing marijuana, first state in the country, right? And so one of the first things I did as Attorney General was flew back to Washington, D.C. to take a meeting with then U.S. Attorney General Holder to talk about this issue and any potential conflict with the then Obama administration, right, federal government, and the state of Washington. And my message there, as much as I'm a supporter of Barack Obama, that's really irrelevant to my job, which is defending Washington state. And the voters had chosen a path, legalize marijuana. And especially at that time, there was a lot of concern that the federal government might try to stop Washington and Colorado from legalizing marijuana. So my message to the Attorney General was simple. I mean, it was, hey, if you sue us, I'm going to defend Washington state. And here's why I think we'll prevail in this case. And we wanted to work with the federal government to see, hey, did they have specific concerns that we could work with them? And so leaving a lot out, there was a lot of communication with the federal government around specific things we could do as a state that would address some concerns they had. Just as one example, marijuana edibles, for example, right? Marijuana edibles can look like candy bars. I've got 2 kids upstairs, if they see candy bar on the kitchen counter, they know what to do. Eat it and don't tell mom and dad, right? So we want to make sure those are not marijuana infused products that would be appealing to young children who might not know. So we took actions as a state to make sure you cannot have edibles that would be in a wrapping paper that would be appealing to children, right? So this one example of many, many dozens that we took to avoid that kind of a conflict. Looking ahead now with the new administration, I guess what I would say is it's impossible to predict, but I guess I feel pretty good about where we are as a state in terms of legalizing marijuana, and I do not think a conflict will come to a head with the federal government. I say that, not a guarantee, but that the reason primarily I think that is because since 2012, when it just was Washington, Colorado, the national conversation is only going in one direction. More and more states are legalizing. Red states, blue states, purple states, doesn't matter. And so I just think, politically speaking, the train has left the station, so to speak, right? That I just don't think the federal government can come now and try and put a stop to what's going on in states all across the country and the elaborate regulatory systems that have been put in place. And so I don't think that's going to happen. Again, never say never, but we have literally for a long time in my office, we drafted memos. We were prepared to go to court if we had to defend Washington's system. It's never come to that, which I'm thankful of. And if I had to bet on it, I think we're going to avoid that conflict for the time to come.
All right, good. And what about other things that are on the horizon you talked a little bit about the cases against the multilateral companies that, sort of big litigation there, but in terms of just other big issues, since a few of the questions did touch on that, just given the change in administration nationally.
Yeah, so I guess a couple things. So one is I guess if we're sort of looking a bit nationally with the change in administration, maybe two thoughts on this. So one is that that there are now challenges to in some ways that it's the Republican AGs are sort of now on the offense essentially, right? And that our role may change, right? That there are decisions out there that we want to protect. We may be filing amicus briefs on the other side, right? So yes, our role will change. Importantly, number two, I should say that while at this point we haven't filed any litigation against the current administration, the cases that we have when Joe Biden walked in the door are still going. In other words, in many instances, Joe Biden cannot, with the stroke of a pen, undo a Trump administration decision. So if we had litigation going on from 2 years ago, it very likely is still going on. The fact that there's a new president doesn't change anything, right? The court cases are still continuing. So what's changed for us is not new cases aren't coming in at the same rate we had before, but the ongoing litigation is certainly still there. One thing I guess I would just point to as an issue that's a focus is voting rights issues. That's whether it goes back to the Postal Service. We obviously had some experience on that, and that you're seeing in states across the country a lot of changes in voting laws, access to the polls. And while Washington State is not a party to those lawsuits, one thing I just made this a chance to kind of mention this as Attorney General. One thing I can do is file an amicus brief, a friend of the court brief, in any court in the country if I feel I need to advocate for the people of the state of Washington somewhere else, because someday there could be an impact on our state if that case eventually goes forward, gets to the Supreme Court, and there's a decision that impacts us as well. And so in that area, I have an interest in that area. We have expertise in our office, and we're very involved in those kinds of amicus briefs on voting rights cases all across the country, going back to the last election, but carrying forward as well.
Okay, great. So I'm going to ask, someone's asked a question about a tool, and in particular, universal injunctions. And those have, received some criticism and I'm wondering, so the question then is, what is your view about the continuing utility of universal injunctions in connection with the push by some to limit or prohibit their use?
Yeah, it's a good question. That this is one I thought about a fair amount. So these, just so everyone's on the same page. So national injunctions, any federal judge, when we go to court, the first Muslim travel ban, we were within a week in front of a federal judge, Judge Robart, a judge appointed by a Republican president, by the way, arguing about whether or not the travel ban should be stopped in terms of injunction. A federal judge has the power to stop it nationwide, of course. So for some folks, it seems, wait a second, some judge in downtown Seattle can literally stop a presidential executive order nationwide. How can that be? I mean, I'm oversimplifying, but in general, the idea is, hey, if you have a travel ban, if it's unconstitutional, it doesn't work to have one state where it doesn't apply, but it applies in other states. You can't have a checkerboard for some of these things, right? For dreamers, for example, well, dreamers can't be deported in Washington, but they can everywhere else. You've got to have sort of a system that's a level playing field for many of these issues, and is universal across the country. I guess what I would say is that, look, I understand why some folks wonder, well, how is that possible? A federal judge has that kind of power. I guess a couple things I'd say. Number one, there's a limit to that, right? One can very quickly get before a 3-judge panel in a court of appeals, right? And to seek to overturn an injunction. That's number one. Number two, I do roll my eyes a bit with some of the criticisms I would see of national injunctions. So for example, I was reading a former U.S. Attorney General was very, very critical under President Trump, was very critical of these national injunctions. I Googled that Attorney General when he was a senator. He praised a national injunction when it came out when Barack Obama was president and a Republican AG had stopped Barack Obama. But he praised this federal judge in Texas, where I was, for putting a national injunction. So a lot of that is political, right? Right now, people who criticize me for getting national injunctions, I've noticed none of them are complaining about Republican AGs who are seeking injunctions against Joe Biden stuff. So the way I look at it is, at the end of the day, for me, is it's just, if you have a good case, right, you will prevail. If you have a bad case, you won't. And even if you get in front of a friendly judge, let's say, right, who makes a decision that seems out of bounds, the other losing side can quickly appeal to a 3-judge panel and get in front of that 3-judge panel very quickly. The Muslim travel ban case is a good example. We won. The administration challenged that, and we were back in front of a 3-judge panel within, Professor, it was fast. Like within a couple of weeks, we were back in front of a 3-judge panel. We won again 3-0, by the way, and the administration chose not to appeal to the Supreme Court. So it's not like that thing just sits there for years. If you want to challenge it, you can challenge it. You can challenge it quickly. And so there is a means to do that. So look, is any system perfect? No, but I think it beats the alternative of having some sort of patchwork around these huge consequential constitutional issues where some states it applies one way and some states another. That doesn't work. In fact, some ways it would not be workable at all. So I think it is a system. I don't think it's going to change. What I would say, maybe a final thought, is it's my sense, I can't prove this empirically, Professor, but it was my sense as we litigated throughout the 4 years that judges became a bit more reluctant to issue the national injunctions towards the end of the Trump administration, that they would apply the injunction to just the plaintiff states, for example. I don't want to overstate that. I'm not even sure it's true, but that was the sense that I had, and some members of my team has that maybe, right? And keep in mind, in Washington, we led 35 lawsuits. We litigated in front of the same judge sometimes multiple times, right? And I can imagine if I was a federal judge, I'd be like, oh, am I going to issue my 5th national injunction, right? That's a lot. And so part of it is just human as well, right? We file a case. If we're leading it, we're filing it here. We're not filing it somewhere else. We're filing it here in Washington State. There's only so many federal judges in my state, so they were used to seeing us in court over those past 4 years. So we were mindful of when we asked for national injunctions. And also, I will say it's extremely difficult to get an injunction. Just the legal standard to get it is very, very difficult. So don't ask for it. You're dumb as a lawyer to ask for it if you don't think you can get it, because it actually hurts your case. It doesn't help your case. So there are all sorts of checks around the system Judges don't hand them out like candy. That's not the way it works. You got to have a good case, and you got to persuade that judge. And if you win, the other side can get before a 3-judge panel at the Court of Appeals very quickly.
Great. So our next 3 questions are really about advice and sort of advice to law students, community members, even your new counterpart in California. But before we go the advice route, I actually think it'd be helpful to hear a little bit about your path to the AG's office. And so we'll maybe hear about your own personal story and then come back to what advice you may have for others.
Sure. So, I mean, in terms of my path becoming Attorney General, it's, I mean, to make a long story very short, I guess I would start by saying, you know, I'm from a very large family. I'm one of 7 kids. No lawyers in my family. You know, I remember there being a lawyer in my neighborhood, you know, kind of thing. But it wasn't like I grew up around the law by any stretch of the imagination. And so, and what I guess what I would say is when I finished high school, what I was most involved in as a young person was actually the world of chess. I was very serious about chess, played chess all the time. So when I finished high school, I did not go to college. I tried to become a professional chess player. So just give you a sense of scale, when I was all of your ages, I was actually going to Europe and playing chess in international chess tournaments, and I'm going to college, for crying out loud, right? So to say that being Attorney General wasn't on the radar would be a very, very big understatement. And so what I did, I think, Professor, was, I'm obviously not a professional chess player anymore, but what I did that seemed to work for me was I did things and pursued things that I had the greatest interest in. I was not motivated by money. I don't really care about money. I don't care about material things. I drive a 25-year-old car, 20-year-old car. I don't even know how old it is, right? I just don't, I don't think about money. I'm not motivated by money. I don't really care about it. And so, you know, what I am interested in is sort of public service. I wasn't sure what that was going to be. Would I be a teacher? Would I be a public defender? Would I be a social worker? I wasn't really sure, but I sort of made my decisions around that after I left chess behind. And eventually it got me to law school. Yeah, I will say that I always had an interest in politics. So not AG specific, but I grew up in a household, 2 Republican parents who were very active politically. As a kid, they would often have Republican candidates for office, governor, Congress, mayor, come to the home, and like be a coffee hour, and the neighbors would all be there. And so I remember as a kid seeing that and being interested in that, like, oh, this is interesting that the parents of all my friends are here. They seem to care about what this person's talking about. It seemed interesting to me. So my parents really valued politics. You know, they never went into it themselves, right? They never ran for office, but they participated very actively. And I'm sure that just had a huge impact on me. And so I always thought about politics as sort of a noble thing to do, as a good use of one's time that could make a difference. And so that clearly got me interested in running for a local office here. And then once I was in the local office here, when I thought about running for a higher office, you know, the office that always struck me as being the most consequential was Attorney General. You know, if you're interested in the law, if you're interested in policy, if you're interested in politics, I think Attorney General is literally the most consequential office that a state has. And that's what kind of pushed me at that time, much later in life, to run for Attorney General.
And so first of all, I just have to ask, you said your parents were Republicans.
Mm-hmm.
So then how do you have family feuds?
You know, I guess what I would say is, and of the 7 children, by the way, full political spectrum of the 7 kids. And so I guess what I would say is that, now keep in mind, the Republican Party back when my parents were Republicans is different than it is today. And so, but what I would say is that if you're going to have a functional family, right, you have to find a way to navigate differences, whether political or otherwise. You just have to. So 7 kids and 2 parents in a home, you've got to figure that out. And so I think our parents were just very good about, how about this? When I went into politics, I'm sure my dad would have preferred if I ran as a Republican. I have no doubt about that. But I was a Democrat. Those are my politics. And he supported that 110%, right? And so I think we were lucky to have parents like that they supported their kids with whatever they just want you to be involved. They want you to care about the world, to be engaged in the world. You know, they just kind of want you to give a damn, basically, you know? And so I think that was a gift to all of us. To, you know, do we tease each other a bit about politics? Sure, of course, but we're able to have those conversations even now, right? Even now, which I think is healthy.
Great. So let's turn to some advice. So first, is there anything that you'd suggest for law students if they're considering a career with an AG's office? What should our audience members be thinking about right now?
Well, if folks are thinking specific about an AG's office, I guess what I can say for our office is kind of things we look for in general. So one thing I would say is that I know that as an office, we are interested in folks who have demonstrated an interest in public service of some kind. So whatever that is in your life, right? Find a way. And I know when you're in law school, it's busy, but still find a way to, like when I was in law school, I worked at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. I spent a summer representing Yaqui Indians in Guadalupe, Arizona. I advocated for death row inmates, for example, got a public interest grant to do that. So find a way to plug into that, right? And I know that's easier said than done. Law schools are expensive. I get that, but find a way to plug in, even if it's a few hours a week, right? Or a few hours a month. Demonstrate your interest in public service. That matters to my team when we make hiring decisions. I would say number one. Number two, wherever you apply, right? The top three things to work on are your writing and your writing and your writing. Write well, learn to write well. I mean, talk to someone who's a mentor who can help you to write. Like really, I cannot tell you, right? Work on your writing. It's so important. It's so critical to the work that we do, in the briefs we write, in the communications we have. So working on your legal, take every opportunity you can to work on. Everybody can improve their legal writing. Everybody can improve their legal writing. I really encourage you to think that way. And then number three, maybe just a bit more general would be, look, I mean, being a lawyer is, you know, a real privilege, right? And as a lawyer, the law is a powerful thing, right? The law is a powerful thing. And if you know, in our system, and that's a big if, but if you can get to a courthouse in front of a judge and you have a good advocate, which by the way, we have all sorts of issues of access to justice, by the way, right? And good legal advocacy. But if you have an advocate who's good, when you're in the courtroom, it's a level playing field. You can take on the biggest corporation. You can take on a president. You can do those things, and it's a level playing field. That's the beauty of our system. So I always found that really appealing about the law. And I guess what I would say is that I spent 4 or 5 years in a corporate law firm to pay off my law school debt. So I'm never going to criticize that people go that route. I guess what I would say is if you end up becoming a lawyer, there is so much need of people who need a good lawyer to advocate for them. And I'm not saying you got to spend your entire career doing public interest law, but what I am saying is give serious thought to spending some part of your career doing that kind of work. Look, when I left my private law firm, I worked for a great law firm, fantastic experience, but I knew when I walked out the door, Professor, that I'd seen them. There's literally a stack of 500 applications from lawyers who are better lawyers than me, who are going to come and take my spot and be just as good, if not a better advocate for our corporate clients as I was going to be. That is not true. That is not true for millions of people in our country. They don't have anybody. There's certainly no list. They don't have anyone to start with. And so, look, if you actually want to make a difference in your life as a lawyer, and believe me, you'll make a profound difference. You can literally change people's lives. And if you use the law in that way to advocate for people who need an advocate. And I just encourage you to think about that because it's a need that we have, and the law is such a powerful tool. We need advocates who do that work.
Great, powerful words. I think at a very important time in people's lives as they're really thinking about who they want to be, right? And I think one of the beautiful things about a law degree is that it allows you to do many things. And so you can wear many hats in your career, but always keep an eye on doing good. Following up on that, someone asked, believing in a continuum of justice and community, what can students and community members do as allies for justice? So perhaps a little bit broader.
Sure. I mean, it's interesting. I appreciate that question because, it's been my feeling in my time I've been in politics now, I guess 20 years, so I guess it's been a while. And, it's been my experience that students, young people, have a much larger voice than sometimes they think they might have. And I think that's changing, right? Look at the conversation around gun violence, which is one example, right? Where everyone stands on that issue, it's undeniable that the voices of young people has changed the conversation around how elected officials think about gun violence and about changes to gun laws, for example. And that's just one example. I've met with students who have organized rallies here in my state with thousands and thousands of people attending, right? And met with them to talk about that issue specifically. I know from my experience with bills before our state legislature, where I've testified with high school students about bills that impacted high school students. And I can tell you from personal experience, look, another guy in a suit at a press conference or in a hearing, okay, great. But if you have someone impacted by a law, a young person who can speak about that with knowledge and eloquence is far more powerful than, frankly, me with my suit and tie on as the Attorney General. So I guess what I would say is whatever issue you care about, whatever that is, right? Really, I mean, whatever that is and whatever side that issue it is that you're on, just engage on that issue, right? Whether it's a political campaign for a local candidate or whether it's an issue on the environment that you care about, plug in. And believe me, if you work hard at it, you will be value added for any organization. That's just a fact. And so the key to me is being engaged, and especially right now in our time. And again, this is not, it's whatever that issue is for you, you know what that issue is, right? And the key thing is to get involved. And I wouldn't worry too much about it being sort of the perfect thing to start with, right? I think the key thing is to get engaged, and you kind of figure out a bit as you go along a little bit, right? It doesn't mean you always get it right the first time. You may get in there and realize, wait a second, this is interesting, but this thing over here that I see, I find even more interesting. And that worked for me. I spent a year doing volunteer work for a year through the Jesuit Volunteer Corps. It's like the Peace Corps of Vista, but through the Jesuit community. So I was working in a inner city environment, helping people with food, clothing, that type of thing. But in that neighborhood, Professor, there was a legal clinic, and I got exposed at legal clinic. And that is, I just had the sense that the folks in that legal clinic were addressing issues at a more systemic level than I was. I felt I was helping people, but it was a Band-Aid to get through another day or another week. That's important. If you want food, you need food. But I felt those lawyers, that legal team, were addressing things in a different way. And that kind of got me interested in the law. And I applied to law school when I was doing that work. So again, that if I had not been for that experience, maybe I wouldn't have even applied for law school, but I got exposed to something doing that work that really changed my life.
Wonderful. So maybe we'll take it back to the national conversation for a minute. And I should say, folks, that we have about maybe 5-10 minutes left of our session. So if anybody does have additional questions for Attorney General Ferguson, please do feel free to chat them in the Zoom or in the Whova app. But thinking about just the makeup of the attorney generals nationally, you have a new counterpart in California. And one question was, what advice do you have for him?
Oh, I'm not sure if I can really give advice. I guess what I would say, if I was going to give advice to myself 8 years ago when I was starting, maybe is the right, maybe the way I'll reframe it a little bit is a couple of things. One is, California is a huge AG's office, like Washington. It's one of the few that are bigger than Washington. So it's like you're the managing partner of a very large law firm. And so, one has to be able to delegate almost everything, right? And decide what are the very few things that you, as the Attorney General, will decide that you're going to be engaged in and that your team knows must go to you. And for every person, it's different what that is, right? So for me, civil rights, consumer protection, the environment, right? These kinds of issues that we're talking about, those are the ones my team knows, those are coming to me every time, right? I'm very engaged on those. But you can't do it all. And deciding what's true to you as an Attorney General, right, is really important. And then number two, you've got to hire people, your chiefs of staff, chief deputies, the division chiefs, who are really, really good at managing all those legal teams and know what needs to go to you and what they can and should decide. And that may be easy for me to say, but take my word for it, it is not. If you've got great people, your life is so much easier. If you don't, you worry about that division all the time. And then I guess what I would say, the third thing is, it's, how do I want to say this? It's, I mean, obviously you can have some hard decisions, right, that you have to make, right? If your team is bringing you a decision, it's by definition harder, they would have solved it, right? So one thing I have found is that in making those decisions, maybe two things have served me well, and I think are maybe good advice in general for people, for what it's worth, is that I've learned to trust my instincts on things. That how about this? If I have an instinct about something and I end up making a different decision, if I talk myself out of it, I've almost always regretted it. So I simply have learned, if my instincts really are telling me something, even if my teams advise me a different way, I trust those instincts, and that has almost always paid off for me. Everyone's different, right? For me, trusting those instincts has been really, really important, and I think has worked for me. And then number two, what I would say is that you often get cases that are so damn complex, right? And there's so many factors to think about, right? You got all these states and they want this, or these groups, and there's a million things going on. And how you decide how to resolve a case or file a case, or what I would say is, I have found that in some ways, the more complicated the decision is, the more, I hope this doesn't come out the wrong way, but the more I try to make it as simple as possible. Okay. Like, well, what is the essence of this case? What is this case really about? Well, what's the kernel of truth in this case? And to focus on that. And I find that if I do that, a lot of this other stuff, I'm not saying it's totally unimportant, but it's not as relevant as whatever that one truth is. So maybe a good example is this opioids litigation, right? we have against these distributors. Do we sell this case? How much money is enough? Or do we litigate it? And my approach so far, Professor, has been, you know what? That's complicated. You could argue it either way, but right now my feeling is I want those entities to have to walk into a courtroom and bring in their executives and testify under oath and have a judge decide what they did was right or what they did was wrong, right? That they have that accountability. Is that the right decision? We'll find out, right? We'll find out. But at the end, I decide that is the most important thing for those who have suffered because of opioids in my state. And so in some ways, sort of distilling things down as simple as possible when it's really, really complicated, I find for me that provides some clarity and I think helps me make a decision.
So let me just ask you one follow-up question. So what law school doesn't often teach us is how to be a good manager, but yet being a good manager, being a good team player is actually essential to the practice of law, especially when you're doing complex litigation. Do you have any words of wisdom just in particular on that point?
Oh man, I have a lot of thoughts. So the answer is yes. And look, in our office, look, our very best lawyers are not necessarily our best managers. Trust me, we're aware of that. They're aware that that is a entirely different skill set. So I guess a couple things I would say is a few things in no particular order of importance is if you are ever leading an organization, I guess I would say to folks or a part of one, but particularly if you're leading a team, your team watches you really closely, how you interact with them, how you behave under stress. So, for me, I just have some rules. I never yell. I just don't raise my voice. I don't use profanity around my team, right? And I just like a calm environment because look, the decisions are tough enough as they are. The last thing I want is some stressful environment making that decision beyond what's already stressful. And so that's on me to sort of set the tone, I think, for the office and those interactions. So that's number one. I don't like being yelled at. I never liked when my past bosses yelled at me. I didn't work better because they were yelling at me. So that's kind of my philosophy, I would say. Number two is that, maybe I'll just mention a short story. When I was doing public interest work as a law student, the first client I ever had, I went down to Guadalupe, Arizona, and I was working with the Yaqui Indian community. And I was assigned to a Jesuit priest who's a lawyer, does public interest work on behalf of the Yaquis there. And I remember I was just there. I was ended my first year in law school. I knew nothing about the law. And I went to see him on the first day. And he said, okay, hey, head down the street. You're going to meet with Mrs. Garcia. I'm kind of making up her name. You're meeting Mrs. Garcia. She had a legal issue. A life insurance company was not paying the proceeds. There had been a death in her family and they weren't paying her the proceeds. It was a lot of money. He said, go down there and figure it out and get her money. And I said, great, when are we leaving? He said, no, you're going on your own. And I remember thinking, well, I don't know anything. I remember saying to him, I said, look, David, I don't know the first thing. I can't help her. He said, no, you'll be just fine. And what he said was really good advice. He said, Bob, just go down there, listen to her carefully, and then you'll figure out what to do. But that advice of listening carefully to your client or your coworkers is important. So if you're in a meeting that I have with my team about a case, I'd probably do the least speaking about the case. They talk about the case, what's going on, and my job is to ask questions, right? And then make a good decision. And so I think that works well for me. Maybe the last thing I'll say is that especially for sort of future lawyers, is look, you all have the experience of being a first-year associate at a big firm or being a new lawyer at a public interest place, whatever that is. You'll be the youngish attorney, the new attorney, and you'll be in a meeting with a partner or a supervisor of some kind. And I guess what I would say is that when I worked at a private law firm, obviously I was the one working the weekends, working late night, drafting the briefs. There'd be a meeting with the client, the partner's there. Well, I knew the most about that case of anybody in the room. I'd spend all the damn time. I wrote the thing. I knew it, right? I knew all the cases. The partner didn't, right? I'm briefing the partner. And I remember once a partner saying to me, Bob, you need to speak up more. You know the case, right? Better than anybody else. You need to speak up. And so it was really good advice. I just felt like, well, the partner will handle it, right? So one thing I need from my team is, look, if you're in a meeting with me, my expectation is you're there for a reason, and I need you to speak up and tell me what you think. And if you see me going off in some other direction and you don't think it's right, you kind of need to say something. You need to say something. I may or may not agree, but I guess what I'm saying is if you're in those conversations, you're there for a reason, and you should speak up. If you have an opinion about something, don't be shy about that. I mean, obviously read the room and your role there and be civil about it, but you need to speak up. That's really, really important. And a good boss will value that. And even if the boss does not agree with you, don't worry about that. Your job is to say what you think and share your thoughts. And that's super important to me in my role. And I think it is for any good supervisor that they need that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I know we did get a few more questions in from the chat, but alas, we are out of time. But Attorney General Ferguson, I just want to say it's been such a pleasure talking to you. It's clear your passion for the issues, your dedication to the state of Washington, to these important issues that we at ACS all care about. You're really an inspiration. And on behalf of everyone, just thank you.
Oh, thanks so much, Professor. Thanks to all of you. I hope you get great success in your future, and hope you're all staying healthy, and good luck to all of you. Thanks so much, everybody.
Great. Thank you.